Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to Autism Fridays with Christopher Cleveland.
Welcome to another episode of Autism Fridays with Christopher Cleveland. I'm your host, Christopher Cleveland. In local news, the governor of Utah has retracted the text message order mentioned last week, and the public health order concerning social distancing has been extended to May 1st. All relevant restrictions on lodging, gyms, salons, massage parlors, and other such places will be enacted until then, and efforts to gradually open services like education will be first priority starting May 4th. The idea is to open the state back up, provided projections keep looking as good as they have been, in phases so that any outbreaks that happen in the future can be curbed immediately. More important, should all education services be restored to their former existence, it would be just in time for summer camps to begin in June. Speaking of which, schools are now mandated to finish the school year online. In my county's case, the last day is May 29th, which means that services such as my after-school job will be dismissed until then. Restaurants in Moab will be allowed to apply for a gradual reopening for their indoor capacity on May 4th, as long as things keep looking the way they do, and will most likely start at being allowed to support 30% capacity at most, should they be allowed to reopen at all. That, or else, like a local restaurant I enjoy can do, will only be allowed to support people outside while still allowing them to sit down. All movements toward opening the state back up for business will, of course, most likely concur with the national plan to reopen the country from quarantine that has been devised by the Center for Disease Control. Here in Moab, strict measures are especially important considering that we're a tourist town, and so asymptomatic victims of COVID-19 have a higher chance of bringing it and causing our local healthcare system to be overwhelmed quickly were that the case. However, the state has allowed anyone who exhibits even one of the symptoms to test for the disease, vamping up efforts already underway. So far, Utah can still boast some of the lowest numbers of cases in the country as it is, but this new measure will likely increase the number of people we know are infected exponentially. The state has also joined the country in permitting companies who attain blood and plasma to begin paying those who have developed antibodies against COVID-19 for every donation they make. Companies such as BioLife and St. George have already begun to pay out bonuses of at least $100 to anyone tested to have the antibodies. Understandably, families across the board continue to wonder about their future and how they will support their children. This is especially true of those families who neither are essential workers nor have one providing income for their families. Amongst these are several families with at least one autistic child, or, in the case of one mother I know, 2 or 3, who are all on the spectrum to varying degrees of severity. That brings me to this week's big announcement following this break. Thank you. Thank you for tuning back into this episode of Autism Fridays with Christopher Cleveland. Once again, I'm your host, Christopher Cleveland. Now, before the break, I mentioned I had an announcement to make, and I do. For starters, when I began this, I planned as far as covering Autism Awareness Month. I had no intentions of continuing episodes during May, as I initially didn't have any idea of a relevant awareness theme I could use to ensure its continuation. But as I thought about it, I asked myself if there was one. So imagine my surprise and grateful delight when I discovered that Mental Health Awareness Month was next month. Yes, autism is itself a mental disorder, don't get me wrong, and we've discussed the characteristics that make it one. However, my biggest concern with continuing the show was taking away from the theme of Mental Health Awareness Month in so doing. After all, autism had its own awareness month, and this was much broader, including disorders like post-traumatic stress disorder, schizophrenia, bipolar, obsessive-compulsive disorder, the list goes on. So, I made a poll, asking my group members if I should continue this project into May as part of the Mental Health Awareness Month. Had they voted no, this would have indeed been the finale of the series for at least this year like I had originally planned. However, as I dug deeper, I found research that indicated the possibility that keeping mental health awareness as part of the focus was applicable. In fact, I even found articles from the National Institute of Mental Health, aka NIM, which was consistent with that idea. However, I wanted to make absolute sure that there was sufficient enough demand by reaching out to members about continuing it into May. However, I'm pleased to report that out of 59 members, 21 voted in favor of continuing the show. With the hope of more on the way in the near future, I would love to see those votes turn into about 30 at least, so that way I have a safeguard. But the point is that it looks like there's a sufficient demand. So by the time I began filming this episode, I had already had about 11 votes within the first couple of days, with 10 more that followed then after. So here I am, having said this was going to be the finale, only for people to insist that I continue throughout the next month. So, in talking a little bit about what all will be entailed with Mental Health Awareness Month, I think it's important to say, as I mentioned before, I don't want to undercut it or underscore it in any way. So the episodes that premiere after this will be somehow tied to a mental health issue that makes these episodes broader. An example of this can be compatibility between a schizophrenic family member and an autistic one, or something of that nature. Another example might be how PTSD might heighten autistic symptoms, something that keeps the essence of the show alive, but pays heed to Mental Health Awareness Month in its overall aim. Will I succeed in that endeavor? Well, only time will tell. But for now, we're looking at a combined total of 9 episodes for this year's series. There might be a June expansion, but there will definitely not be a July one. Reason being is that May and April contain causes that bear the most relevance in this show. In April's case, autism awareness, while in May's, there's a more general mental health awareness. In June, however, I realized there was a safety awareness month I could exploit, and I just might do that, especially as it pertains to applying CPR to an autistic person, or applying any kind of medical aid. I realize this sounds like it would be more prudent to have it as an announcement on one of my live videos, but to be honest, I didn't plan on much more than that. Not until I saw the polls and saw there was a demand for this to continue into the next month. And with that, we'll come to questions from home after the break. Thank you for tuning back in to Autism Fridays with Christopher Cleveland. Once again, I'm your host, Christopher Cleveland. For our segment Questions from Home, we have several questions asked by Daniel from Moab's Grand Area Mentoring, who asked enough questions, by the way, to cover this segment for the remainder of the season. However, in the interest of making sure we have episodes, we'll limit it to about 3 or 4 questions at the very most. And for this episode, we will start with, Dear Christopher, why is Autism Awareness Month important to you and to our civilization? What do you personally hope it achieves, and what are its official aims? Very great questions, Daniel. And in the interest of forming a very logical and informative answer, I'll tackle the last part of the second question first. The official story of Autism Awareness Month is that it was started to educate the public about autism spectrum disorder, and more important, educate the public about autism as a developmental condition. What this means is that it would educate people on what could you expect from a very severe case, what could you expect from a mild one, what could you expect from a moderate one. In savant autistic children, what talents might manifest. Basically, it was about bringing to light the information that science had been able to make available for the public to enjoy and consume at leisure. As for my hopes, however, it is that in addition to these official reasons, it'll also help the public become more aware of not only what autistic people face now, but what they can overcome, as long as even one person says, I believe in you. All it takes is several thousand neurotypical people people who don't possess a formally diagnosed disorder, by the way, telling the autistic community that they have faith in their abilities to begin the chain of positive change in the lives of those who are autistic, myself included, and I can attest to how effective this is. As for why Autism Awareness Month is important to me with these hopes in mind, well, when I started becoming more transparent in my case, and started trying to advocate for others on the spectrum, I was about 15 years old and had started an advocacy club in my freshman year. I was unorganized, as one might expect as a teenager, and I lacked the kind of momentum I needed by myself to really bring about change. So I focused instead, having failed in making an effective advocacy club, on using my actions to prove that this was an area worthy of attention. I then went on to win several accolades and trophies in debate, win some esteem in tennis, and work on the yearbook as well as the school newspaper. Basically, I was on the role of an autistic person could do anything that a non-autistic person might be able to do if they just have one person in addition to their family who says, I know you can. So when I heard about Autism Awareness Month after I became an adult, I decided I would celebrate it every year. The reason why, as well as why it's important to civilization in my opinion, well, I've noticed a funny trend in Western cultures like ours, that when a cause has a substantial period of time, even a day, dedicated to them, then it tends to bring transparency to whatever issues are relevant to that person or cause. The tradition, interestingly enough, has its roots in Greco-Roman history and is at the heart of why we have 12 months in our calendar year rather than 10. With the Greeks, it kind of began with funerary games that lasted up to 2 weeks at least, depending on the significance of the royal who died. In the Iliad, Homer talks about Achilles successfully negotiating 10 days of peace with Troy on behalf of the Greeks, during which his fallen enemy, Prince Hector, is mourned by his people. But in Roman times, months were often set aside either in dedication to a god or to a person of extraordinary merit. We have June in our present calendar because the Romans set aside an entire month to celebrating Juno, queen of the Roman gods. We have March because of the Romans celebrating the war god Mars for the same reason, and giving him gold, giving him food, giving him whatever they believed would work in the way of sacrifices to ensure that Rome continued to have a good streak in conquering lands. We also have July because Caesar dedicated a month of festivities to the celebrations of his conquests after he centralized power in the Roman Republic and became a lifelong dictator, as did his successor Augustus, initially named Octavian, who set aside the month of what we now call August for his triumphant rise to power as the first emperor of the new Roman Empire. And even in America, when a cause has a month dedicated to awareness, it tends to bring out more information, education, awareness, hence the point of these, by the way, and tends to have some effect in inspiring change. In the case of race or ethnicity, for example, we have Black History Awareness Month, which usually takes place in February and seems to keep the fires alive for what Martin Luther King Jr. fought for. In fact, Martin Luther King Jr.'s birthday usually factors into the February festivities of Black History Awareness Month, which is probably why it's set in February. Now, while people who actually fought in the civil rights movement, such as Morgan Freeman, have come out and said that dedicating a month to awareness is a preposterous idea, calling for more consistent awareness throughout the year, a sentiment I admittedly echo, I think having a specific awareness month tends to bring people together who might otherwise think they're fighting alone. And that's where the importance of Autism Awareness Month comes in for people like myself who are on the spectrum, or people like my parents who care or have cared for one. Basically, it's the idea of making connections. It's making people realize that they share a common struggle during a specified period of time. All right. Anyway, I hope that answers your first question, his first load of questions, Daniel. And also from him comes, dear Chris, what causes autism, and what is the latest research? Well, this is a tricky couple of questions to answer, in part because there's a lot of debate about that. What's confirmed from the latest research is that there is a genetic element. An example of this is that if a man is born with autism, he has a pretty good chance of passing it on to his own children. Research has also shown that there's a good chance that if one child on the spectrum is born, then another one can and oftentimes is born from the same pair of parents. Now, those chances tend to dwindle if you have settings where, for example, the father has two different baby mothers or something of that nature, or the mom has three different fathers for three different children. For example, my setting where my siblings and I have different fathers, but I'm the only one of the three, that is autistic. We also know that there is a plausibility in the disorder being passed on from generation to generation. And we know that if two autistic people meet and have children, it's almost an absolute that they'll have autistic children of their own, genetically speaking. This is not always the case, and to be fair, there are times when autistic parents will give birth to non-autistic children. It's just that the majority of the time that's not the case. We've also made great progress in how early we can detect the signs of it in children as well. I'll give you a case in point from my own personal experience. When I was diagnosed at the age of 4 in 1997, no one could get a diagnosis earlier than 4 or 5 years of age for certain. However, the diagnostic criteria and the science behind detecting autism has since come such a long way that we can detect it and recognize it as soon as 6 months of age in some parts of the country. We also know what doesn't cause it, as there was a humongous debate on mercury-based vaccinations causing it. The debate began in the early 90s, more or less, where a British psychologist by the name of Andrew Wakefield proposed that MMR vaccines ingested during pregnancy would cause autism. Considering the state of desperation for many parents at the time, even the scientific community bought into it for a time, until several contemporaries of Wakefield's discovered they couldn't replicate the conditions he turned into his report and not attain nearly the same data even if they had replicated the conditions to perfection. Unfortunately, he was later found to have falsified much of his process, his data, and to have omitted data which contradicted the idea, which marked him as a fraud. Unfortunately, for us all, even though he was barred from medical practice in the United Kingdom, there's still a strong movement in the United States that he partly fuels, by the way, which still suggests that there are links between vaccines and autism as part of the quote-unquote anti-vaxxer argument. While I won't get into everything I find wrong with that for the sake of time and keeping it relevant, the scientific community as an overwhelming consensus has been able to rule out any potential links between vaccinations of any kind and autism so far. Now, that's not to say that this investigation into vaccinations hasn't yielded benefits, because it has. Nowadays, we can afford to give our children vaccines that don't contain mercury or don't contain MMR, and we're able to safely assume that as such we've also prevented certain brain damages from forming within children, especially as more mercury is ingested or taken in or whatever by pregnant females. You also asked a question about its prevalence, and to that I simply say, tune in to the next episode, where we'll continue the discussion on what the current research suggests about prevalence, statistics, etc. That said, however, I've tended to find over the years that Americans tend to be so consumed by the growth of anything they don't understand that they tend to be too frightened by the numbers to ask what they can do to help those who can be counted in the growing population. I feel like the COVID-19 case is proof of that, where a lot of experts will tell us that most of the numbers we hear are numbers of people already infected over 60% of the time, and not new cases. Autism, while by no means as likely to kill someone as COVID-19 and by no means capable of spreading as fast, has caused such panic and fright at its increased numbers that people don't see past that and ask themselves how they can change their world and education level about the issue at hand to accommodate them. Instead, the collective population tends to ask itself, how can we change these numbers and the people who qualify to placate our fears? Make no mistake, I don't say this in insulting terms. I say it as an observation I've made about what's considered normal human behavior by even several psychologists and sociologists, and I think that fear of the numbers rather than curiosity about helping the people within those numbers is at the heart of why there isn't more research and education available presently. And it doesn't help that we have people in places of power and influence who gleefully exploit that. However, that's just my experience. So I thank you again for those questions, Daniel. I'll urge you to tune into the next episode for further answers to more of your questions, as I would urge anyone who is interested in the answers to these questions, or maybe have questions of their own that I might answer in future shows. And if you like this episode, please remember to share, subscribe to the channel, and give a like to this episode. I hope you've enjoyed it very much. I have enjoyed doing this for Autism Awareness Month. This has been Autism Fridays with Christopher Cleveland, and I'm your host, Christopher Cleveland. Thank you. Starring, edited, directed, produced, and written by Christopher Cleveland. Thank you for tuning in, and we'll see you next week. This episode is dedicated to the Moab Regional Hospital, where some of the frontline medical warriors who fight COVID-19 bring testing, information, and much more to Grand County, Utah. I am honored to say that I personally know the CEO, prominent administrative figures who work for her, and even a couple of the front desk people who have greeted me at the door, not to mention a couple of the doctors who fight to keep our community safe, as well as the housekeepers who work hard to keep the hospital clean and well supplied with fresh materials in their quest to eliminate COVID-19 in our community. Despite what you might be seeing, the community is grateful for what you've done, and so am I. Keep fighting the good fight, and I hope to see you all next time. This has been Autism Fridays with Christopher Cleveland. Thank you.